The egg had been in my care for 11 years before anyone outside the conservation vault knew it was still alive. That is the honest accounting of it. Not 11 days, not 11 weeks. 11 years of quarterly humidity logs, of adjusting the substrate temperature by half a degree in the shoulder seasons, of writing in my incident reports that artifact A7 listed in the Verath Station Heritage Catalog as ornamental ovoid draconic culture, provenance uncertain, condition inert, continued to show no signs of degradation. Every quarter I wrote those words. No signs of degradation. I did not write the other thing I had noticed, which was that the shell, held to the conservation lamp at a certain angle in the low hours of my shift, held a warmth that had no business being there. I am a conservator. I have spent 31 years tending dead things with living care. You learn after a time what dead feels like. Stone feels dead. Ceramic feels dead. Ancient timber feels like it remembers something, but it does not push back against your palm the way a living thing does. The first time I felt it push back, I thought I had imagined it. The second time, I set my hand flat against the shell for a full minute and felt the faintest pulse. Not a heartbeat, nothing so regular, more the way a coal will surge when you blow across it. And then I sat very still for a long time before I wrote anything in my log at all. What I wrote was, shell integrity stable, substrate temperature holding at 31.4 degrees, no signs of degradation. I want to be clear that I knew what I was doing. The catalog had A7 provisionally assigned to the Dravith period, which the scholars had placed at roughly 40,000 years prior, which made the notion of a living embryo inside it so far outside institutional credibility that reporting it would have produced one of two outcomes. Either the item would be transferred to a research lab for invasive analysis that would almost certainly destroy whatever was inside, or I would be quietly referred to the station medical officer for a cognition assessment. I was 53 years old. I was not willing to risk either. So I kept it warm. I recalibrated the substrate cradle to 33.1 degrees. Within the tolerance range, the catalog permitted for stabilization of ancient shell compounds, and I wrote 33.1 in my log and did not write the reason. I sourced a second lamp and angled it. I began staying past the end of my shift on the cold season months, not because the vault system could not hold temperature, but because I found I did not like leaving. I talked to it eventually. Not much and not often, and I will not reproduce those conversations here because they were private and also because they would make me sound like a man who had come slightly unmoored from the facts of his situation. I was not unmoored. I was, if anything, more anchored to that vault than I had ever been to anything. I am simply saying that when you tend something in silence for years, occasionally you speak. It responded in the way that it could respond, a shift of warmth, a deepening of the pulse. On one occasion in the 7th year, something inside moved, a slow rotation, like a sleeper turning over, and I had to set my notes down and press my knuckles against my mouth for a moment before I could continue. The catalogers did their annual reviews. They noted artifact A7 stable, inert. They signed the form, they left. I stayed. In the 11th year, the shell began to change color. Draconic shell pigmentation, as described in the heritage literature, is a fixed property. The compound structure sets within decades of laying and does not alter thereafter. So when the deep gray-green of A7 surface began, over the course of perhaps 6 weeks, to resolve into something closer to bronze, I understood that what I was witnessing was not a conservation anomaly. I pulled every paper on draconic embryological development that the station archive held, which was not many, and what I found suggested that the pigmentation shift coincided with a developmental stage that the literature called the final preparation. The shell was thinning from within. I moved my cot into the outer room of the vault. I told station administration I had identified a humidity fluctuation that required overnight monitoring. This was not untrue. I monitored humidity. I also did not sleep very much. On the 43rd night, the shell cracked. Not all at once. A single line running from what I had always thought of as the crown down and to the left, perhaps 4 centimeters. Then silence for 6 hours. Then a second line crossing the first. I did not move from my chair. When the hatchling finally pushed through, it was in the early morning, and the vault was full of the kind of quiet that accumulates over years of careful tending. It was small, smaller than I had expected, though I realize now I had no rational basis for expecting anything, and its scales were the color of dark bronze going to gold at the edges, and it was shaking with cold and exertion, and it turned its head and looked at me with eyes the color of deep amber and made no sound at all. I had a warming cloth ready. I had had one ready for 4 months. I wrapped it and held it against my chest and sat very still while it stopped shaking. That is when the proximity alarm at the vault's outer door sounded. I heard voices in the corridor, many voices, speaking in a language I did not recognize but which the station's translator rendered haltingly as formal Dravith High Register, a dialect the archive had on record but no living speaker had used in recorded history. I heard the station security officer attempting to explain that the conservation vault was a restricted area. I heard the security officer stop speaking. I heard footsteps, many, and measured, and very large. The inner door opened. They were tall, scaled, and they came in folded, wings drawn close, heads low to clear the frame. And when they straightened, there were 7 of them in a room built for one conservator and his instruments. The foremost was a female, ancient by any reckoning, her scales the deep burgundy of old stone, her eyes the same amber as the hatchling in my arms, and she looked at me for a long moment before she looked at the child. The sound she made was not a word. It was not in any register the translator could reach. It was the sound of someone who had believed for a very long time in something that no one else was willing to believe in, and had just been told they were right. She lowered herself to the floor of my vault. Not a bow in the formal sense, something older. Her head touched the ground in front of my chair, and the 6 behind her did the same, and the only sound was the hatchling shifting against the warming cloth and making, at last, a very small noise. I sat very still. I do not know precisely what I said. I think it was something like, "He was cold, I didn't want him to be cold," which is accurate but not perhaps the remark the moment called for. The translator rendered it. The matriarch, I understood from the archive records later that this was what she was, lifted her head and regarded me with an expression I was not equipped to interpret in full, but which contained, unmistakably, the quality of recognition. She spoke a single phrase. The translator took its time. Then it said, "Keeper." Not a title from any human system. Not a rank. Something older than both of those, from a language with no other living speakers and very few surviving documents, which the archive scholars would spend the next several years working to fully gloss. What the best of them eventually settled on was something between guardian and the one who remained. The matriarch and her court stayed at Verath Station for 3 weeks. In that time, the hatchling, who I had been quietly calling A7 in my head, and who the matriarch named in a ceremony I was not invited to, but was permitted to observe from the doorway, grew by approximately a third in length, ate a considerable amount of protein supplement intended for the station's research animals, and developed a habit of sleeping on my cot when I was not in it. I was eventually invited to sit. The matriarch's senior attendant, a slate-gray male with ridges worn smooth by what I estimated was several centuries of living, translated that invitation with a formality that the situation did not require but which I understood was not for my benefit. It was for the record. There were forms for this in their system, ancient ones. The act of tending across the dark, of staying, had a name in the high register, and that name was now attached to mine. I have a different role now. The title on my station directory has not been formally updated because no one in the administration has been able to identify the correct form. I still log temperature and humidity. I still write my incident reports. I wrote one last week that said, ward integrity stable, developmental milestones nominal, substrate temperature holding. And then, beneath it, in the notes field, which I have never used in 31 years of service, no signs of degradation. I meant it differently this time.